All right, we are live. Welcome to another episode of Roasting Marshmallows. My name is Rolf Zuid, and I'm your host. So today we are talking about the President of the United States, and the President of the United States is usually considered the most powerful person on the planet. And indeed, the U.S. has the biggest economy, the most powerful military. They have Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Hollywood, and even the NASA for the space agency. But how did America become such a powerhouse? With a little imagination, you could compare America's life cycle to that of a product or maybe even a company. There's the introduction, rapid growth, disruption, and renewal. With that comparison in mind, one could imagine the president to be the chief marketing officer selling us the American dream. What lessons can we draw today from developing the product that is America? We are roasting marshmallows today with Jason Voiovich, author of the book Marketer-in-Chief, How Each President Sold the American Idea. In it, Jason retells the story of America, but through the eyes of its most influential salesperson, the president. Jason's favorite way to observe the world is through its history, and he believes the people from the past have plenty to teach us about the challenges and opportunities we face today. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about this subject. Obviously, it's a passion of mine.
Awesome. Is it a passion because of you're a history buff?
I am. I have an entire bookshelf full of histories of all eras, cultures, places in the world, and up until this particular project, I wasn't really clear what the connection would be between, that love of history and my day-to-day in product innovation and marketing. And this project, in many ways, was an attempt for me to think through what those connections would be. And that's really what surprised me is I came to realize that over the course of my career, I had been using those sort of lessons. And, I had been taking lessons from historical figures and applying them to my product development career, my marketing career, not even really noticing it. And so this book was an attempt for me to be very intentional about that and think through how I did it.
And, because there's a lot of presidents, of course, was it easy or was it hard to, because I can imagine some presidents will be easier than others. So what was the hardest president to really map to the idea of them managing a product or managing a brand?
Boy, each one was challenging in its own way. I'll admit that. Some you might think a Ronald Reagan, for instance, who was known in the United States and really around the world as the great communicator. That's a little bit easier to get your arms around from a marketing perspective. Very difficult when you talk about a person such as James K. Polk. How do you think about that? So there's a lot of learning that I needed to do. I found a lot of gaps in my own historical knowledge of each president. But I think the most difficult presidents to get my arms around were those that were paradoxically the most popular.
Okay.
The Abraham Lincolns, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, George Washington, people like that, because there's been so much written and there's such a mythology around them, that it was hard to choose just one story, one aspect of that. That was incredibly challenging. It helped that I wasn't trying to write a history of the United States. It's more of a very narrow slice. I make that very clear in the book that I will point you to histories, but I'm looking at a very narrow band of the president's role.
So how did you figure that out?
Even that said, that was hard.
How did you figure that out? Did you just read everything and then pick out what you like, or how does that work?
I read, someone noted this for me, a reader, one of my advisors who read the book, counted, because in my endnotes, and I have endnotes on each chapter, where I describe what I read and what I learned briefly. He counted that I must have read about 125 books. And I think that was low because I didn't use every book as a source. So yeah, to your point, I probably read 150 to 200 books over the course of this. And for me, that's I love it. It wasn't some people go fishing, some people watch Netflix. I read books. So it wasn't a chore, but at the end of it, you realize just how much information you've taken in and just kind of finding a place in the hard drive that's your brain to figure out what to do with it is not easy.
Yeah, I think you guys can relate, right? And he can, Arno, because you guys, like, every time I talk to you, you're reading a different book. So I can imagine you guys also, like, read all the time.
But I'm not
But again,
200
125 is...
Yeah.
It wasn't over the course of 3 months or something like that. It's really over the course of maybe 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
That's still
it's
a
still a
lot,
lot.
but it's not unreasonable. And
Depends how many kids you
I'll
have.
admit. Oh boy, I'm glad my kids were old enough to be out of the house at that point. I'm not sure I could have done it raising little kids. That just completely unrealistic.
So if like I'm being very honest, right? Like for me, the U.S. history is not something that I studied or like put a lot of effort into my hard drive to understand it. But as Rolf said in his introduction, it is a very important country, right? And has a lot of impact in a lot of things we do. And before this conversation, we were discussing about like how product or how IT companies, mostly in our target, would compare with like the leaderships of US president. And then I was just thinking, like, for the fun of it, do you think you could map like, oh, Facebook would be this president, Microsoft would be more likely to be this type of president? Do you actually have ever done like a mapping towards that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are some organizations, you know, the one I highlight in the epilogue that talks about Joe Biden, the current president. Kind of not fair to really write a history of Joe Biden.
I don't know. He's pretty old, right?
Yeah,
It's huge.
it is. He is pretty old. But it's a little insulting. The dude's alive, and he's the current president. So you got to show some respect there. But my take there was exactly as you described. I compared the challenge he faced with the challenge Kodak faced, the challenge IBM faced, as they reached that same part in their organizational life cycle where Kodak, for instance, most people know about that organization. They made their money over the course of a century making film, chemical film. It really wasn't cameras where they made their money. They made their money on film. Well, most people don't really realize that Kodak invented the digital camera, has a huge chunk of the patents on digital cameras, and introduced some of the first digital cameras. It just simply couldn't pivot away from film cameras fast enough to supplant the Japanese and the Koreans and now the Chinese who are making.
And how's it comparable to Joe Biden? Because I'm not really familiar as well. But
the comparison is a similar stage in the United States life cycle, where the United States in many ways is kind of past its peak. And has it, if you look at the most dynamic economies, the most dynamic countries in the world, it's undoubtedly China, India, Brazil. So when you think about that, very similar to the position Kodak faced in the early part of the 2000s. Joe Biden faces that same challenge. So really, instead of Joe Biden is a Kodak, more to say that Joe Biden and Kodak faced the same life cycle challenge from an innovation and from a product perspective. And that story I tell, and I compare and contrast the Kodak story with the IBM story and how IBM handled that differently. And Kodak is essentially a dead company walking. IBM, while not the same as it was before in the 1950s or 60s, remains a powerful organization today. So there are two paths there that Joe Biden can take. I'm not sure which side of the fence he's on right now, but I have my opinion.
So basically, if I understand what you're saying, is the comparison is more like, so the country would be in a state, and the president now is there, and he has to have a very hard call to make it, because I saw a discussion on Twitter about that if you look from US on the big span of history, like if you're going to wait for 100 years, you're going to be able to see that US is in a bit of a downgrade thing in terms of a lot of metrics. But right now it's just too much, it's like too little time to be able to actually see in the bigger picture. So I can understand the comparison if you say that indeed it's like Kodak, or that they really need to shift gears. Otherwise, in maybe 40 years, things are going to be much more different. We're not going to be discussing about US, but we're going to be discussing about China.
It's already a bit the case, huh?
Yeah, I think it's already the case,
true.
frankly. And I think it's really the study of history is really the study of context. And, it's just part of the point I make in using that kind of innovation metaphor and that life cycle metaphor is that it's not fair to compare what Joe Biden is facing with what Thomas Jefferson faced in the early part of the country's history. It's not fair to say, well, how would Joe Biden have handled the Louisiana Purchase from King Louis or from Napoleon, frankly, in France at that time, because there's such different contexts of where they are that you can't compare the two. So if you think about the context, where is the United States at right now, then you can look at brands, companies, organizations, and see what other organizations face that same type of challenge today, and what conclusions can we draw by comparing the two.
And do you think the U.S. has been in a similar position in the past before, where they had to make, reinvent themselves a little bit? Like maybe, I don't know, when the Great Depression was there, for example?
Yeah, I think one thing that you can look at when you look at Ev Rogers' diffusion of innovations framework, kind of the theoretical model I use for the book. People seen the bell curve, this innovator, early adopter, early late majority. You guys get it. Your listeners will get it. At each of those different phases, when the organization crosses the chasm, for instance, to coin that term, to go from kind of innovator, early adopter to early majority. Each of those transition points is a psychological transition point. So the United States has had several of those. The transition from kind of that innovator, those first 5 presidents, to the ones that followed, was a real transition point into just the psychology and sociology of the country was a transition point. So yes, the Great Depression, that era was a unique era in American history, but it wasn't the only one. Not even close to the only one. That we faced, and that's what I like about the diffusion of innovations framework is it maps the psychological change over time as people buy and adopt products and organizational life cycles, and we can see that. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say that, for example, when the Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, like way in the beginning, they were like breaking new grounds with creating the country, basically. Is that comparable to like the achievements that, for example, Kennedy made when he said like we're going to put a man on the moon within this decade, and America actually pulling it off? Like, are these things the same types of the same kinds of achievements in terms of greatness?
Yeah, I think maybe how I would compare that to an example that people might recognize is kind of the Washington and Jefferson, Adams, those folks were really like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak inventing the Apple computer for the first time. Hugely innovative, but a different sort of thing than Steve Jobs launching the iPhone and the iPod and the iPad much later in that life cycle. The organizations are in two very, very different places where the first Apple computers were basically made in a garage, and that's essentially, if you look at John Adams, for instance, was the first person to move into the unfinished White House executive mansion, and it was like a garage. There was crap everywhere. It was not a nice place to live. Fast forward to Kennedy, for instance, talking about putting a man on the moon and bringing them back safely. That's very much like the 2008 introduction of the iPhone, where Steve Jobs walked up onto stage holding the iPhone in his hand. Very different sort of challenge, but Apple was in a really different place there too. Apple had the resources. It had the tech. It had the design skills. It had that kind of market moxie that the United States had in the 1950s and 1960s. It had that power to be able to do something transformative and innovative. So I think thinking of it in that way is maybe a more appropriate way to think about the difference in context between those two eras.
I would say that, for example, for the because the part that I don't know if I agree with it is that US had the power, right, big on that time to go to the moon, for example, because basically they decided to go there because they were losing the space race, right, and they didn't know how to do that. So I think they were actually not the Steve Jobs; they were more like the Microsoft, trying to catch up with everybody else, and yet they managed, right? So I think it's more like they were a few steps behind, and they had a bold decision to just do like, yeah, we need to make it. And I think that's what makes the story for me more interesting, is that, they took the leap, right? And then they were not really, and they not only matched it, but they did one step even further.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't disagree with you there at all on, on that comparison. What I might say is that when you take a look at the history of like Walter Isaacson's biography on Steve Jobs, and he covers that particular era pretty well on kind of the launch of the iPhone. And Apple was very much behind at that point. When you think about BlackBerry, you think BlackBerry was the dominant smartphone manufacturer at that time, research in motion. Apple really wasn't seen as a in the mobile space. They had the iPod. They had something much like the United States had a space program at that time, but the Soviet Union was ahead in every meaningful way. And what Steve Jobs and Kennedy needed to do is set a goal that was a leap beyond just an iterative, like they had, the Soviet Union had Sputnik. Well, we can't just make a bigger Sputnik. We need to do something that is
Beyond that.
kind of a quantum leap beyond what the Soviets are capable of doing right now, even if we don't exactly know how to do it, because Jobs and team absolutely did not know how to do that when Steve Jobs said they were going to do it. The team at Apple thought he was crazy, absolutely crazy. But they found a way to get it done, much like the United States of that era, and NASA figured out a way to get it done because they had that vision that propelled them forward.
And unlimited money.
And that's really that power of vision and power of the idea.
And I think that you mentioned Kodak with
money
the
helps.
cameras, right? But like also a lot of people don't know that, but Nokia also built the iPhone before the iPhone, if I'm not mistaken. And yet they couldn't get that thing because, well, apparently nobody wanted an iPhone. So they keep making that mistake.
Yeah, Nokia is an interesting case. I don't know if you all did. I had
multiple
3 or 4 Nokia phones. Yeah, I had a Razr. I had a Crazer. You know what that thing was? It was like the thinner red one. I had one of those. I had the chocolate bar phone, the Nokia 5160.
I had the unbreakable brick, also the one that doesn't break.
3310, I think.
Yeah, that one.
Fantastic.
Exactly.
With the snake. So
I loved those phones.
Man.
Those were great.
So we're talking about a lot of products that are like innovative, such as the iPhone and stuff, and then this maps back to the actual idea of America, right? That's kind of the point that we're trying to get to here, because we're hearing a lot about the American dream and stuff like that, but I guess that's not really what was the reason that George Washington started. Well, not George Washington, like the founding fathers, I guess I should say, started the U.S., right? And to me, that is interesting to think about, because like when you have a startup or when you have a product to sell, you really have like this vision and this idea. Do you think the founding fathers had that same idea, like, hey, we're going to build this awesome, great country, or did they just want to have independence because they were just tired of being bullied around by outside forces, basically?
I think it can be both things.
Oh.
When you read the histories of the era, I think part of the challenge I have with the teaching of history in general, American history specifically, is that kind of the seeming inevitability of it all. That, well, of course, we had this grand vision and that we would achieve this grand vision over time, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. When you actually read the diaries of the people at that time, it's really a mix of things. My favorite are to read John Adams and Abigail Adams' diaries. We have thousands of letters that survive between the second president and his wife, and both of them were extraordinarily smart and accomplished people. And when you read their correspondence, there's a mix of both things. There's a mix of vision, and kind of high-minded ideas, mostly from Abigail, by
His
the way,
wife.
and a whole bunch of just day-to-day sort of concerns from real people. And that's what makes it so fascinating when we kind of strip away the kind of the big ideas and these big themes, and when we kind of get down to what real people were thinking as they were really doing it. I see a lot of similarities in the diaries of John and Abigail Adams to what happens inside a startup organization. There's a mix of I have this big vision for what I want to accomplish, and I'm tired of working for X, Y, or Z company. Or this product is not serving a market, and I'm mad, and I just want to fix it. It's a mix of things, and that's okay. Life is messy, and that's what makes it interesting.
And how did they go on with that? Did they actually solve that for their case, or do they match their day-to-day problems with their vision, or how did they solve that? Look at it.
I think of all the presidents, when you look back at all of them, that John and Abigail Adams did the best job of clearly articulating their vision and working towards
And
it.
do you think the other presidents have a vision? Because from the outside, from this side of the water, let's say, it seems like, oh boy. Especially the last few, let's call it like that.
Some have been better than others. My criticism of the last two presidents, the current occupant and the prior occupant especially, but to an extent President Obama as well, has been a lack of vision. And their visions, history does not look kindly on those who look backwards. And when you think about Make America Great Again, when you look at Build Back Better, when you look at the visions that are being touted by the most recent occupants of the White House, notice something. They look backwards. That is fundamentally, when you take a look at that from an innovator's perspective, product development perspective, marketing perspective, when you see that,
Claims a downfall.
you know the organization is in a lot of trouble.
Wouldn't it,
because it doesn't have a forward vision, it has a
wouldn't it
backward
compare to like you are married and you are just doing like how do you call that thing? You
Postmortem?
renewing your vows again?
Oh.
Yeah, I think if in agile language or Scrum language, we would call it a retrospective, a sprint retrospective. That's fine. I think there are conversations that the United States is having regarding gender roles, regarding the role of race, regarding the role of inequality and power. Those are important, and those are, in my mind, useful conversations that need to happen very much like a sprint retrospective needs to happen. You need to crystallize what you've learned in order to move forward. However, the issue, the role of the marketer-in-chief, the role of the chief marketing officer, is to create a vision for the future and crystallize a vision that people can move towards. We've been in this retrospective phase for perhaps the past 20 years. That is not useful to stay in a retrospective too long. It's not good for companies. It's not good for organizations. Not good for product development. And it's not good for nation states.
It feels like
we can't navel gaze
like you're
much
afraid
longer.
of moving out of that.
That's right.
And is it?
Yeah, we're afraid. We haven't really decided what the. I just read an article this morning on the new book coming out from the New York Times and the 1619 Project that addresses, kind of crystallizes, the role of African slavery in the United States as really the true founding of the United States in 1619 versus 1776. Very different perspective, legitimate field of inquiry, absolutely, but again, backward looking in terms of what was things, how much do we, I'm not in a position to decide when is the right time to cut off debate and move forward. That's not a role that I have. No one has asked me. But I do know that the United States today, in my marketing opinion, lacks a forward vision. And without that, it will be difficult to move forward from kind of the sins of the past to reconcile them and move forward is a very difficult
do you think they're scared to do that?
For sure. Absolutely. It's scary to move forward. All of us on this podcast know that. Most of your listeners will understand that. Change is terrifying. Yep. And, when you take a look at, the Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, the first 5 presidents, they didn't really have an option. No. There wasn't if they hadn't won the Revolutionary War, if they didn't make something happen, the alternative was anarchy. The alternative was chaos. They had no choice. What's difficult in mature organizations or mature nation states is to change. It's like, well, is the change more painful than the status quo? And we see that at Kodak, we saw it at IBM, we see it at Microsoft, we see it at Accenture, we see it at all these large organizations. Change is hard, but that's what it's actually I think it's a more difficult challenge that a Joe Biden faces than a George Washington faced, for exactly that reason, that change is hard. And the alternative is not complete failure. The alternative is a slow decline in status quo.
I think I'm going to challenge at least this idea of change is hard, because I've read this interesting book that I keep forgetting the name, but I will put it in the notes. But the thing is, the guy explained very well that for me it will resonate, right? It's like change per se, it's not hard. And we use the word a bit interchangeable, but like transitions, those things are hard, right? And he basically explained this in a way of like, for example, I'm from Brazil and I moved to the Netherlands. And I was in love with the idea of changing. And I love the idea of changing. But the whole process of finding a house, getting a visa, getting a plane, create a new... this is a transition of actually officially moving, right? And this is what... he described, and that I can resonate to myself, like, yeah, that's the part that I don't like, the transitioning from one state to the other. It can be a bit daunting, but the change per se, I think, I think people like that.
I think that's an excellent point, that I think how I would say that is, with a vision that is positive and draws people forward, we all know there's going to be hard work between here and there. There are going to be a lot of difficult things, as you just described. But in your case, the vision of moving from Brazil to the Netherlands, this idea in your mind, that vision of wanting to do that, pulled you through the challenge of doing it. But what if you didn't have a vision? What if it was, well, I don't really want to move to the Netherlands.
Yeah, then I think you just don't move.
I kind of have to. Then it sucks. Then it's terrible. Then the change is daunting and difficult and everything is a chore. Whereas when you have a vision to move forward, plus, it's sometimes I say change is hard and people push back on me much in the same way you did. And they say, well, if someone said you can cuddle with a puppy for 10 minutes, that's a change, but you're probably going to be okay with that. That's
I like puppy is not. I should remember it.
Unless you're allergic.
Unless you're allergic to the puppy. But the whole thing is, if you paint a vision for people that people enjoy, people will realize, okay, I might need to take one of those rollers on my shirt because it's going to shed all over my shirt, and I might have to clean my face because it's going to lick my face, but the enjoyment is worth it.
I have a question towards that, because sometimes I like, we always talk about the president, right? For example, we always talk about Elon Musk as a CEO, we always talk about Mark Zuckerberg, and we tend to basically summarize that the vision is from them. Like, in your researches from those books, like, are actually these visions from all these presidents actually coming from them? They are really this magnificent person who has this vision that nobody ever realized, or they are just the great communicator, the right person, the right time, or how does this come to be?
Yeah, I think the complicated and unsatisfying answer is that it's both of those things. But here's the role that the president faces as marketer-in-chief. Their role isn't necessarily to create the vision as much as it is to crystallize it and communicate it. Because when you think about culture, generally, and kind of visions generally, and we've seen this in organizations, right, that there are a lot of competing visions. There are lots of different ways that people talk about the vision, about where we want to go. It's actually quite rare to walk into an organization that has a singular focus, and it is absolutely crystal clear. It's often a competition of ideas within organizations, especially larger ones, but certainly smaller ones too. It's the job of the chief marketing officer and the chief executive officer by extension to decide and crystallize what is that going to mean to people? How are we going to move forward in that? What things will move us forward in that direction, even if they don't seem to completely 100% align? And what things are we going to say no to? What things are not going to be part of that vision for moving forward? That's often the more difficult part, is to say, no, we are not going to continue to support that product.
Yeah, but sometimes...
even though... Yeah, we see it all the time.
But sometimes in companies you diverge from a vision because it didn't work out, or anything can happen.
Yeah.
Did you experience? Or did you see the same in the U.S. presidents as well? That they changed while sitting in office?
You bet. Almost all of them faced situations that were partly in their control, partly in their influence, and largely not. There are, when you think about, especially the presidents that led up to the Civil War, the presidents right before the conflict, were kind of swept along by forces very largely not under their control. And, the growing sectionalism in the United States at that time, the outright conflict, the Civil War had actually started well before Fort Sumter in the 1860s. It had started. The conflict had started across the Kansas-Missouri border well before then, and was kind of flaring up in areas all over the country before then. So the presidents tried a lot of different things to try to address that, and largely failed.
And what did he try?
Largely failed to communicate that.
What did he try? Did he change the vision? Did he set up rules? How did it work? And why did it fail?
Yeah, the part of the vision at that time, when you read about that era, was the vision of good fences make good neighbors. And what that largely means is, okay, well, if the South can be the South, the North can be the North, and if we kind of if we kind of avoid the conversation of slavery, we can kind of live together in one union. Okay. The problem, of course, was not only is the immorality of all of that kind of logical calculus, but the practical problem was that the United States was growing, and people were moving west. They were populating the states across the Mississippi River into the western half of the United States very, very quickly. Well, as those territories became states, how would they enter the Union? Would they enter allowing slavery or not allowing slavery? And the fight around all of that, and essentially the southern slave-owning states realizing that from an economics perspective, the economics of slavery would not work in the West, and frankly, were not working in the South. They were financially stressed. People backed into a corner tend to fight their way out. And it was very difficult from marketing can't do everything. Communication can't do everything. If you can't market, you can't advertise your way out of a bad product.
The president
in the United States at that time was a bad product. And the presidents largely failed in their marketing role, almost inevitably.
And did he change his vision? Did he correct?
Excuse me?
Go ahead, I know.
Oh, I was just wondering if he, while this failing happens, did he correct his vision, or did he move somewhere else? Or did he let it burn?
The vision at the time, if you read the diaries and read the histories of that time, every president without fail wanted to keep the Union together. That was the vision. That singular vision was a United States. But that wasn't the competing vision at the time, and most most Americans have trouble reconciling this is that lots of people, not in the South, but in the North, essentially advocated, let them go. We don't want any part of that. The United States would be better off letting the southern states secede and let their economy collapse on its own. If you look at the economic maps at that time, the southern United States was not prospering and likely would not have been economically viable on its own. And there were many people in the North who observed that situation and said, listen, let them go. And in 10 years, they'll be back. They'll come back because they really don't have a choice. But people like Abraham Lincoln, but his predecessors as well, fought against that idea. They had that vision for a united United States that really didn't waver materially throughout that entire time. It was probably the best example of a singular vision for presidents that we've really ever had, is keep the Union together.
Well, that's probably why
in that era.
Yeah, why was it so hard to get that message across? I mean, of course, they did not have very good communication methods, I guess, back then. But because the idea of a single nation sounds pretty good, I guess. But yeah, I guess the marketing message was really, really tough then at that time.
But you had a fundamental, irreconcilable difference in a vision of that it was okay to keep people in servitude, and it was not. There are certain things in it's almost impossible to equate that to kind of an organizational decision. It just, the closest you get is something like General Electric deciding to break itself into 3 companies this past week because it could not reconcile that those 3 companies should have synergy together. But to compare that to human servitude is obscene and inappropriate. So there isn't a good analog. It's more like a divorce. That just complete irreconcilable differences, and one vision of kind of how humans would interact in a society, and another vision of how they would. And I'm not sure there was any way to communicate your way out of that difference. Right. I think the Civil War in many ways was absolutely inevitable, and it would come down to guns and a lot of bloodshed. I don't think there was a way to market your way out of that problem.
Well, maybe not the best comparison, but in companies it's a little bit similar, right? Because if they change the vision, people will fall off the boat. They either leave or get fired or... Yeah. Not that brutal, but they won't shoot you out. But
no, I mean, people don't go out. People don't go out with different uniforms and muskets and shoot at each other. Thank goodness. But you're right. From when a company changes its vision, there are a lot of people in the organization who have to decide for themselves, do they still want to be a part of it or not? And that happens all the time. And I think it's that kind of free flow of of labor and ideas is useful because organizations must change and evolve in order to survive in a complex market. And if people are trapped in the organization, organizations can't evolve. Simple as that.
So,
go ahead.
I was wondering, are we going to talk about the best president of the United States ever had?
Oh boy.
Are you talking about Trump?
It's kind of like asking who your favorite kid is. That's how I think about that question is, who was the person who, given the most difficult circumstances,
on the time,
kind of achieved the most from a communicator's perspective. And many times it's the presidents who really have they're kind of two. One is expected and one's not. And I'll describe them both briefly. Abraham Lincoln is the obvious one. And the reason, when you take a look at the the disaster he faced and the competing visions. During the war, most people think that the Americans fully supported Abraham Lincoln and would walk with him till the ends of the earth. Absolutely not true. Most people, his re-election, during the war was not a sure thing. A lot of people wanted to end the war right there, let the South secede and be done with it. The only reason he won re-election is that his generals got some big wins on the battlefield during that time, and he replaced his vice president with a Southerner, Andrew Johnson, which turned out to be a huge mistake, but be that as it may, his sense of humor, not only his ability to... He was a rare communicator in that he could communicate at the highest level. The kind of speeches and the way he could... His kind of poetic language. That in America, we carve it onto monuments. We got all kinds of them.
Yep.
All the way down to his ability to interact with one-on-one, his humor, his sense of humor, his kind of really raunchy, unwashed sense of humor made people love him at a personal level. He was just a rare communicator that could go all the way up and down that. So Lincoln was the obvious one. The dark horse candidate for maybe one of the best presidents, and this is a person who is probably a better Secretary of Commerce than he was a president, was Herbert Hoover. Here's why. Most people, if they know anything about Herbert Hoover, they recognize him from, he was the person before FDR who essentially oversaw the stock market crash in 1929 and didn't do enough to fix that.
Yeah.
Fair. When you look at his career before that, however, the 1920s was a time of massive technological change. We have not seen anything like it. The rise of the internet and the information age is not even close to what happened in the 1920s. Okay. Automobile, airplane, electricity, radio, television, quantum theory, the 30-year mortgage. Hundreds of different innovations came to the fore in the 1920s. And it was Herbert Hoover's role as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge who brought people together to create the regulatory infrastructure and the rules for how that technology and how those innovations would ingrain themselves into American and global life. Without Herbert Hoover, who was a trained engineer, by the way, most people don't know that, he was the one who, if you think about, the rules of the road, like when you drive your car and there are rules and there are stoplights and there's turning and all of that, that came out of Herbert Hoover's industry collaboration in the 1920s. It didn't exist anywhere else, and most of the rest of the world copied what he did.
Interesting.
Yep.
So it's an interesting thing for your listeners to be able to really read about Herbert Hoover's early life, and his ability to communicate and bring people together is really unmatched in American history and unmatched in kind of organizational history as well. He is a case study on organizational leadership that most people just would never read because, well, he was the person who oversaw the Great Depression. Well, that's kind of a historical, not a historical accident. It's really unfortunate. Had he been elected instead of President Harding and President Coolidge, he would have been in those top 3 to 5 presidents, almost without fail.
And I was wondering, it's a challenge to be the president of the United States, I can imagine, especially when you have stuff like a Civil War or a Great Depression. But there was also a time when the United States were number one, top of the world, probably right after winning the Second World War. How easy I don't know who was president at that time, sorry, but how easy is it to be president when you are number one? Like, is it easy to just sit back and do nothing, or is that the time where you need to actually
the grand vision, sit down?
You have to have the grand vision and really, go ahead and steamroll on.
Yeah, that was the real challenge that we see after World War II is just look at Harry Truman, who took over for Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt died in office. Truman took over, had to see the war to its conclusion, which was not easy. There's still a lot of debate today on the use of atomic weapons. The development and use of atomic weapons is not an easy thing to talk through. But if you think about, like, well, how easy was it? Well, Truman was supposed to lose the 1948 election and barely won it, kind of came from behind to win it. And part of that is because once you, there's that old story, like Buzz Aldrin, the first person to step foot on the moon, came back and he said, part of the problem was once you've been on the moon, what next? Like, what do you do then? Like, what's better than being on the moon? And it's, but there's no way, there's no way that human being can be able to do that. It's what do you do next after this pinnacle? And that's really what the United States faced in the immediate aftermath of the war. And both Truman and Eisenhower struggled with that mightily. It really wasn't until you got Kennedy that kind of created that, vision that people could get behind. And it wasn't easy to be Kennedy either, for a number of reasons. But it's very difficult. I think, it's one of the biggest leadership challenges in organizations isn't when they're growing, it's when they are successful. It is difficult to maintain success.
I can definitely, agree with that idea that I haven't thought about until you mention it. Indeed, that, find a vision bigger than the vision that you already achieved. That is already like nobody has done it. It's just like, what the fuck?
Well, for instance, like, what does Apple do now?
Another adapter.
It has completely
great stocks.
It's tough to create that next thing, that next transformative, innovation is really, really hard, especially when you're selling. You're a $1.3 trillion company in terms of market cap. It's hard to do something and say, hey, we're going to throw all that away and do this new thing.
But then let's say, is there any president then actually just let's maintain the status quo? Did it ever happen?
Yeah, that was very much like a Dwight Eisenhower's approach. And Dwight Eisenhower was president after Harry Truman in the 1950s. And essentially during that time, it was the United States and really the whole world was very tired of conflict and had just come off of that. Yes, there were conflicts in Korea and boiling up in Southeast Asia, Africa, lots of places in the world. So let's not underestimate how damaging that was for people who were there. But in the United States, Dwight Eisenhower was smart enough to realize that, hey, people wanted kind of the status quo. They wanted
stability.
Hey, let's just kind of keep things are going good. People are happy. They're building houses. Let's not rock that boat. The problem is that the rest of the world conspires against you. The market does not stay still while you capitalize on your success. And the United States and the Soviet Union in that time were struggling with the Cold War. And Eisenhower made a number of missteps in kind of communicating to the American public, and in many ways, by not being completely honest with people about, the Cold War and about its impacts, really struggled to communicate a vision that was beyond just a conflict with the Soviet Union. Think about that for a second. Just how many people had died in World War II. And now we're in this new conflict. Now we have nuclear weapons. I think Eisenhower and those presidents in that area really struggled to balance that need for a vision with the need to just everyone take a breather for a little while.
Right. And, it's pretty cool when you are president, but at some point, of course, the office, it stops, right? And I think, especially the last decades, most presidents are pretty well off. But I also read some articles where some presidents actually went into poverty after their term ended. And I'm not sure if it's very related to what we're talking about here, but I did find it very interesting, like this world leader, this, powerful person, and then, the job ends and you're a poor guy. Is this considered normal in the
history,
U.S.
you mean?
in history? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, up until modern medical technology, the leader, you died in office, or your head was removed, or some such thing happened. Yeah, most leaders didn't live long beyond their term of office. It's actually quite new historically to have a leadership term that ends and then you have a retirement. People like Harry Truman, for instance, who we've talked about, was not wealthy in retirement. He really struggled. President Ulysses Grant, for instance, was flat broke and wrote his memoirs so that he could give some money back to his family. Now, in the United States, there is a kind of retirement package for presidents that kind of ameliorates some of that. But I think the big thing is it's kind of the Buzz Aldrin problem. What do you do after you've been president? And a lot of leaders struggle. The best one by far who has taken that and run with that is Jimmy Carter, who has kind of leaned into his role with building Habitat for Humanity, and not just talking about it, not just kind of getting on Twitter and tweeting about it, but that dude's out there with a hammer. He's in his 90s and he builds houses and advocates for housing in the United States. It's a really kind of powerful example of, using, your name, as well as the ability to kind of get in and actually work with your hands to make something really happen. It's really inspirational. I think a lot of presidents, after they leave office, struggle with. None of the living presidents is as successful post-presidency as Jimmy Carter.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. All right.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Not really a great president.
Can't have it all,
but a great guy.
So,
and a very successful post-president.
So, and looking at the future, currently, of course, we have Joe Biden. But we've also seen, for example, Kanye West doing an attempt for a presidency because, of course, it's a popularity contest as well.
It is.
I guess the U.S. doesn't really have a royal family, but the Kardashians come pretty close, I suppose. Do you think there's a chance for people like them, or maybe even like someone like Elon Musk going for president, or?
Oh, we elected Donald Trump.
So what?
which is sort of the closest thing which falls into that kind of celebrity sort of category, right? We absolutely elected someone like that. Ronald Reagan
was an actor, right?
A movie star. Yeah, absolutely, he was. He was that. I think when I take a look at an Elon Musk or those sort of folks, I think what they bring to the table is a vision. I think celebrity is not quite the right word. I think it's visionary that is really what the United States needs and needs to focus on. And someone like an Elon Musk can bring a little bit of both of those
Too bad
things.
he's not American.
And that's true. He could not be president. But others could be. Other visionaries certainly could be. There are, plenty of leaders that kind of fall into that category. I'm not sure that we would get that, someone like an Oprah Winfrey would quite fit that mold, but could. In terms of enough celebrity, enough money, and what we would really need is that vision for why would people vote for you. That's the key question.
All right. Well, I think on that is a nice way to end it here. For the future, you need to have a vision. So, Jason, thank you very much for joining us and sharing the Marketer-in-Chief with us. If people are interested in the story, where would they be able to get your book?
The easiest place to find links to the book is marketerinchief.com. You can get links to Amazon, to any place you buy books, anywhere in the world.
We'll include that in the description. I would like to thank the listener as well, of course. If you have any suggestions, feel free to send us an email at podcast@4scouts.nl or on Twitter. That's twitter.com/4scouts. Jason, thank you again very much. I've learned a lot about the presidents of the United States because, indeed, we are from Europe, so we know, of course, the highlights, but not in detail. And it's very interesting. for sure. So
Perfect.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the listeners spending time with us today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Cool.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows, with your host, Rolf Surd. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit 4scouts.nl and on Twitter @4scouts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows.